You're listening to the Break Podcast powered by Career Cloud.
I quit after just under 2 years. And then I just had 5 years where I was working for myself. Like, how am I going to put that on a resume? Who's going to want to hire me? And I think ultimately what I realized was I have a ton of transferable skills, right? And I think that that is true for almost everybody who ends up, midway through their career. Startups in particular look for like credentials, especially honestly the savvy ones, right? And so I think number one, like looking for startups or other types of organizations that care more about transferable skills than they do about credentials is really helpful. But I think, more importantly, understanding what your transferable skills and what the things you're just inherently good at are, I think is substantially more important.
This episode is sponsored by ZipRecruiter. If you need a change and are looking for a new job, or if you're looking to hire for your small business, please check out ZipRecruiter today. Their smart technology matches the right candidates to the right jobs and sends new opportunities right to your inbox. They make finding a job or hiring the right person easier than ever. ZipRecruiter, the smarter way to hire. Try ZipRecruiter for free today by going to ZipRecruiter.com and tell them I sent you. Tim, welcome to The Break. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is going to be really interesting, good conversation. You and I obviously are just getting to meet each other for the first time. We were catching up a little bit before the show. I was letting you know about what The Break is about. And so it all starts with your personal journey. Okay. And so I want to start with people getting to know you a little bit. Talk to us about your first job experience and maybe a little bit about what how you were expecting your life to unfold at the, let's say, ripe old age of around 16, 18.
Yeah. My first job in high school was, I was scooping ice cream for Baskin Robbins.
Perfect.
I don't think I knew then totally what I wanted to do. I was starting to think about college and starting to think about, did I want to study English or computer science? Two like obviously totally different fields. But it's funny, I didn't realize that at the time, but both of those would kind of go on to be pretty big foundations for my career.
Yeah. It seems that way. And so what I'd like to hone in on in these beginnings of these conversations are, Comp Sci and English, as you pointed out, are completely different. What were the influences pushing you in those directions? Because I feel like it's always so unfair for us to think at 16, 18, 20 years old, we are going to, just magically know and map out our life story. But a lot of our direction is influenced by parents or something else. So what were some of the influences pushing you in those directions?
Yeah, I think two things. Growing up, like I always loved coding. I think I built my first website when I was around 10 years old, and was instantly fascinated just like how the internet worked, both from a technical level, but also from like a user experience and a marketing level. Was really fascinated with what got people to use websites, to keep coming back and using them again and again. So that was definitely a place that I was passionate. And I think the other thing that was kind of going on at the time is, around 16 years old, kind of like just a huge shift happened for me. I had always kind of struggled growing up with reading and writing. It was really like a big kind of struggle for me. And I had a teacher at the time who was teaching English, who really had like a sort of a debate style format for the class. And that just like really kind of got me going. And I mean, it's funny as I ended up majoring in English in college and, graduated summa cum laude. So like, I figured it out. But it took, I think, a fantastic teacher And probably quite a bit of luck to sort of make that switch. And I remember, when I graduated from college, my mom telling me, I never was going to tell you this, but I had always been worried you would read, whether you'd read and write at your grade level. And so I think those two kind of things were happening around the same time, and really kind of influenced the direction that I ended up going.
But what was like your first introduction to a computer and to programming then? Since you had already picked this up really pre-college and had an interest, what were you doing as a kid, or what were the influences getting you into that field immediately?
Yeah. I mean, I remember getting our first PC as a family in 1995. It was a Gateway 2000. It had Windows 95 on it. Starting to play around with the internet. I distinctly remember this conversation I had with my dad where I asked him if he knew what HTML was and how to do it. And he was like, I think I've heard of that, but that's about it. And I was like, all right, I'll figure it out. And I did. My first websites were like, just, about stuff I was interested in as a kid. I think I had like a Star Wars website. I eventually had a website that like taught people how to code. And so it was that kind of thing. But, I was always really fascinated with creating things and building things myself. I built games, all sorts of stuff.
And did you go, so your mother was obviously worried about the reading and writing stuff, but did you have any testing done early on to I guess diagnose what the issue, if there was any issue there, or was this something that she tried to shield from you and you picked up on and maybe were self-conscious of?
Yeah, I mean, so definitely no like formal testing. I was well aware of it. I remember doing clicked on phonics as a kid, which, kind of helped, but definitely didn't get me all the way there. So it was that kind of thing. And really it was, it was really a struggle until 16 or 17. And then I think, honestly, the big shift was probably motivation more than anything else. I think I found, English and literature really boring up until that kind of time point. And I think sort of the debate format, that I had, in that class in high school changed a lot. I think some of just the material was more interesting to me. And probably was just, partially a maturity level thing as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that, we so early on, we pick up these aptitudes for certain things, right? That people talk about being right-brained or left-brained or whatever it is. But so much of school, like I think yours is a good story, but so much of school ends up being, okay, that your aptitude is great, but you still need to do X, Y, or Z thing. It seems like in your instance, it was a net positive because you gained skill and an appreciation for something that you maybe lacked. But a lot of times it ends up being an entire, time suck, waste of time, motivation, demotivator for a lot of people. So do you feel like there's anything different about your story aside from maybe just the luck of right teacher, right message, right time that got you over that hurdle? Or is there something else that you've looked back on to think, other people could maybe in the same situation might be able to learn from this?
Yeah, I think, one of the other big pieces that I think made a difference was just my internal motivation for doing just about anything has always been creativity, right? Okay. And creating new things. And I think tapping into that made a huge difference. And so realizing that, English and reading and writing didn't have to be a chore. It could be like an act of creation. I think made a big difference. And so one of the pieces of advice I'd give to anybody is to really just try to pay attention to those internal motivations, and let them guide you in the right direction. Because I think it honestly would have been perfectly fine if I had decided, I'm never going to be into this. And I think ultimately the reason why I was and why I succeeded was because I started working on things in a way that worked for me rather than kind of trying to approach it the way, maybe my teachers and school and our education system as a whole had sort of trained me to up until then.
Yeah. What I find when I've talked to people who are, let's say, in their 30s, 40s, who are stuck career wise, not stuck from like a standpoint of I can't get to the next rung on the ladder, but stuck from a purpose standpoint, right? Well, how am I going to direct the next half of my working life to find some passion, some purpose? What they struggle with by and large is a version of I've never allowed myself to tap into these woohoo, non-logical aspects of myself. When a lot of them are just like plain, what am I interested in? What was I interested in as a kid? And then being able to think creatively about how to utilize that in today's world in a creative way to differentiate yourself or do something different. People are so like assembly line linear minded when it comes to a career plan. And so what we do a lot of times is like we have to destroy that mindset. We have to break that down and get people to think about it's not, oh, I liked baseball when I was 6 years old. It is like, what are the other attributes of that? Why did you like that? What are the other characteristics of you to dig down and figure that out and then use those? Like, let's start to hit the gas on those and creatively think about how we can use them in different ways. So that's a really interesting, story. I mean, I think you do hear people like, well, what are you interested in? And it's sort of like surface level. To me, it's more about like, why are you interested in those things? And then how do we connect the dots of that to what else you could do to sort of like make that intersection of how to make money or whatever that might be. So you seem to have that figured out at a young age. And then,
yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I will say, I don't think I had that figured out until much later. And honestly, it was only in retrospect. I remember doing an exercise, and this was, after founding and selling my first startup, trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And not being, feeling, and this, I did this exercise because I was at the time really stuck. And I basically took a blank piece of paper and I drew a line down the middle. And on one side, I tried to write down all the experiences, starting very, very early, but working my way, forward, that I really loved. And on the other side, I wrote down all the experiences that I really hated. And I tried to be really, really detailed about that, right? It wasn't like, oh, I hated this job. It's like, this particular project at this job for this period of time. And then I just started to kind of like identify the commonalities, right? And it was interesting because I could go back like all the way to like, being like a 7-year-old and playing with Legos. And it wasn't just like, oh, like I like playing with Legos. It was how I did it. Right. Like it was, I followed the instructions and put the thing together, but a day later I had taken it apart and built something else. Right. And that was kind of like a clue, to indicate like, well, this is how I approach problems. This is how I get excited. These are the types of things that get me into sort of a flow state. And doing that, looking at that kind of across time, from a very young age to where I was at the time, around 27 years old, I started to realize like, oh, it really is about the creation for me more than anything else.
What where did you get that idea for that exercise? Was it, did you read that, find that somewhere? Or did you just come up with that on your own? Like, this is how I need to diagnose this problem for myself.
Yeah, I think honestly, I really kind of came up with it on my own. And I feel like I've seen it a few places since then. It's possible it was rolling around in my head prior to that. But I remember just sitting there with a notebook and being like, I have to figure this out. because I need to do something else. I can't, sit here on my couch forever. And just kind of working through it incrementally.
Yeah, it's such a simple exercise, but I feel like the power is in really deeply and honestly going after that and going one step below surface, or at least one step below surface, to connect the dots. Because most people, when they go through exercises like this, and I guide these types of exercises actually all the time, I always tell people, if you're really struggling to come up with what you do want, let's start with what you don't want. The kind of the right side of that piece of paper. What do you hate, right? Like, what do you want to avoid sort of at all costs? Like, start there, because then that at least starts to narrow options. But people the first iteration ends up being like experiences that were positive or negative to you, right? Like, that's how people tend to think. It's okay, well, that's great, but that one experience could have turned out another way if you did it again. So what's below that? Like, what's driving that? Like, take away the result, and then how do you feel about it? So that's like one level. And then another level would be, okay, if you still feel positive about that and you would do it anyway, regardless of the outcome, why? Like, what's the core characteristics of that? And those are what we have to connect the dots with. It's that stuff, because then you can creatively say, oh, well, in a baseball game, I love this feeling. It has nothing to do with how I feel managing a team. Yet, if we look at the characteristics underneath, we can start to build, the commonalities there. So that's like really, it's hard work. It's simple, but really hard.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the proof is in the details. And really being kind of reflective and spending the time, right, to figure it out. And being honest with yourself about, like, okay, like, I didn't like that particular experience because of, this person and the way they, treated me during that time, or because I felt really lost when I was trying to learn or execute on this skill. And I think when you get to that level of granularity, you start to see those patterns and a much clearer picture emerges. Yeah.
So let's get moving through some more of your journey and your story here. So college, you end up doing English, basically, probably, I'm assuming, because you felt like you knew what you were doing on the software side. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I remember that there wasn't an option to pass out of some of the basic comp sci courses, and I kept pushing it off. But all right, I'll do this eventually, but I don't want to do it because it's boring right now, and I kind of I know this stuff already. And then I ended up skipping it.
Right, because the curriculum wasn't going to provide you any value there. So it's really English. So how did you take those two skills then and decide what you were going to do kind of right out of college, first job? Very, very sort of, people always put a lot of importance on this first job and what are you going to do? You're finally an adult, you're in the real world. Like, how did you put all the pieces together to make a decision on what you were going to do?
Yeah. So I also knew I was kind of interested in business. I was an entrepreneurial leadership minor, and kind of knew I had at least a little bit of a business itch, but I had no idea what I really wanted to do beyond that. And in fact, I remember one of my professors in college, who's gone on to be kind of like a lifelong mentor, telling me at the time, Tim, I think you have the skills to be an entrepreneur, but you clearly haven't found what you're passionate about. And I think at the time it was some of the best, but also some of the worst advice I'd ever received. I think the best because it was spot on accurate, and the worst because honestly, I had no idea how to approach figuring that out. And so what I ended up doing was working for a consulting firm. It was one of the big three consulting firms. With the idea that I'd get to try a bunch of stuff and figure it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. portfolio approach, right? Like I think a lot of people do that using, and we'll get into freelance, but like using freelance as sort of a career transition or a bridge to something else, because they take their one skill, but they're able to sort of go find a few different clients and experience a few different cultures and businesses. And that's like almost holding a little options portfolio so that you can signal and decide what's working, and then start to say, okay, maybe it's worthwhile for me to join this one area. So that makes, and consulting is the exact same way, because you're learning really important skills and you're on different teams, you're getting to see different companies, you're working with really interesting people a lot of times, but it's not the one same thing that you're driving at. So I like to use those pieces of advice, like how can you get into some consultative type of a role where you're getting paid to see a bunch of different options. So that makes total sense. So talk to us a little bit about what transpired there and what the next steps were.
Yeah. So, I think when I joined, I had been expecting to get, basically because that was how I was recruited, a bunch of different opportunities in a bunch of different industries. But I graduated in 2008. So the recession hit, and it hit hard. And basically what I ended up doing was one industry, same project kind of over and over again. And it was like 60 plus hours a week, which is pretty typical for the big consulting firms, traveling to glamorous places like Poughkeepsie. And so it was exhausting and not particularly engaging. And so I think after about a year and a half, I kind of started to get the itch to do something different. And ended up leaving, after just under 2 years, and starting a company that did marketing for the beer industry, which was a whole hell of a lot more fun. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I was like 22 years old. But we eventually went on to sell that company 5 years later. Not a huge success, but we made a little bit of money back for our investors. And, I basically got the chance to learn, design and, some more web development and a whole bunch of other skills, in an entrepreneurial setting. And that I think just really solidified my desire to work, in and around startups as much as possible.
All right. So we're not going to skip details here. And Tim, I think there's some details that you're skipping over there and not giving yourself credit for. So at 22, you make this realization that, okay, the consulting opportunity isn't exactly what I wanted it to be, and this isn't probably a great lifestyle. How did it come about for you to start this company? What was the company? Give me some details on that stuff.
Yeah. So the company was called Kindly. We went on to build the #1 beer app on the App Store for about 3.5 years. It started really just as a hobby side project between myself and a childhood friend. Right at the end of college, basically we built a website and then eventually the app that would recommend beers based on your tastes. So it was kind of like the Pandora of beer, if you will, at the time. Eventually I went on to raise, angel investment for the company. We raised about $300K, which, doesn't, I think by today's standards seem like a ton, but at 22 was like, shit, this is a lot of money.
Yeah.
Basically we were off to the races. Our vision, I think initially was going to be, all right, we're going to have all of these users using the app. And so craft brewers who are, craft beer was just starting to boom at the time. Most craft brewers aren't marketers. So, we're kind of like, they're going to need help with marketing. They're going to want to like advertise on the platform. That turned out to be not true at all. Which was interesting. And I think that was one of my, first introductions to the art of pivoting. We went through, 6 or 7 different iterations. before we finally found a business model that worked.
What did that end up being? What worked?
Yeah. So what we ended up doing was basically working with bars to fill bars on off nights. So we would come in on like a Tuesday or a Wednesday, partner with a craft brewer to bring in some like exclusive releases or rare beers, and they would basically do like a tap takeover of the entire bar. And we'd get hundreds, in some cases thousands of people to show up. So it was a ton of fun. Before we sold it, we were doing, I don't know, between 3 and 5 events a week in 12 major metros. So it was a pretty like hectic, frenetic pace. It ended up being a business. I think ultimately we realized that we didn't really want to run. But we kind of found something that worked, and that I think was just a huge learning experience.
You're listening to the Break Podcast, powered by Career Cloud.
This episode is sponsored by ZipRecruiter. If you need a change and are looking for a new job, or if you're looking to hire for your small business, please check out ZipRecruiter today. Their smart technology matches the right candidates to the right jobs and sends new opportunities right to your inbox. They make finding a job or hiring the right person easier than ever. ZipRecruiter, the smarter way to hire. Try ZipRecruiter for free today by going to ZipRecruiter.com and tell them I sent you.
What is that conversation like, or what is that realization like when people have these realizations in their careers, right? They spend 5 years doing something, realize, this isn't for me. From the entrepreneurial standpoint, like there's so much more sort of emotion invested in work from going from 0 to 1, nothing to something, that then you come to a realization, we don't want to run this. Like, what does that feel like? And what's that conversation like with your business partner around, hey, we need to just like do something else long term?
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, a lot of people say like startups are marathons, not sprints. And I think that's absolutely accurate. And it means, you are struggling day in, day out on something that's your baby. Right. And I think, that means the conversations are honestly like emotionally charged ones, right? Like there's a lot at stake personally, beyond just the financial, because you're pouring so much of yourself into it. And I think that means ultimately that what you're working on has to be something that really drives you and that excites you day in and day out. And I think for us, we started the company when we were way too young to really know what we were doing.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't trade that experience for the world. I think it was amazing and ultimately, probably the most formative experience of my career. But I think, ultimately sometimes you end up at a spot where, what you thought was going to work and what was really exciting to you when you started is not what's working now. And, I think that's okay. Right. But when that happens, it also means there's kind of a mismatch between you and the business. And, the only approaches to that are to, figure out if you can change your perspective or ultimately exit the business one way or another, whether that's, hire someone to run the business for you or sell the business or take on a different role in the business. I think a lot of times, in our careers, we have these experiences where we've been doing something for so long that we stop asking whether it's still serving us.
Right.
And I think, that was fundamentally the question. The question we had to answer in the conversation we had was like, do we want to keep doing this because this makes sense for us anymore? Or is it time to move on?
So a lot of times what I hear, which I'm trying to draw this lesson from what you just said and make it applicable to folks in a career setting. A lot of times people who get stuck mid-career come to this realization, right? Like what they're doing isn't serving them, or they're not as passionate about it or fired up or whatever. But they make this false calculus in their head around these, sunk costs, right? They're like, but I've put in so much time and effort. I have these credentials. How could I give up this stuff, right? And I feel like obviously the entrepreneurial mindset is different in that I think entrepreneurs are generally more attuned to this fallacy and are willing to, make these difficult bets, or difficult decisions, I should say, and forego these sunk costs. But I'm wondering if you see that the same way, and if you learned anything from that experience that could help people, in a career type setting.
Yeah. So so it was right after I sold that company that I did that exercise we talked about earlier.
Right. Okay.
And I think at the time, prior to doing that exercise, I really felt like, I was like, how the hell am I going to go get another job? My only real job, I quit after just under 2 years. And then, I just had 5 years where I was working for myself. Like, how am I going to put that on a resume? Who's going to want to hire me? And I think ultimately what I realized was I have a ton of transferable skills, right? And I think that is true for almost everybody who ends up, midway through their career. And I think, startups in particular look for that way more than they, look for like credentials, especially honestly, the savvy ones. Right. And so I think number one, like looking for startups or other types of organizations that, care more about transferable skills than they do about credentials is really helpful. But I think, more importantly, understanding what your transferable skills and the things you're just inherently good at are, I think is substantially more important. Particularly in 2023, right? I think we operate in a world where things are moving so quickly and are so competitive that the vast majority of the like experience from a credentials standpoint that you have is irrelevant, 3 to 5 years later, right? It's really only the transferable skills, the problem solving, the communication, the ability to, persuade, those types of things that ultimately matter.
I agree with that. How do you sort of classify transferable skills? Like we hear hard skills, soft skills a lot. I'm kind of wondering how you help somebody maybe identify the transferable skills and then communicate them, in a sort of job search setting, right?
Yeah. So I tend to think about it pretty functionally more than anything else. Right. And so for me, I ended up making, like at the time, a very skills-based resume. And it was like, I listed all my experiences, but it was way more focused on like, this is the stuff I know how to do. Right. And here's how it serves a business. Right. And so I tend to think about it in terms of the major problems that businesses are trying to solve. Right. Which tend to be things like, how do I increase revenue? How do I decrease costs? Right. If your startup's like, how do I get traction so I can raise my next round of funding? How do I find good people and recruit? Like all of those types of things, right? The stuff that organizations really care about. That's kind of what I tend to focus on, right? And drawing a direct link between yourself and one of those like key challenges, or key drivers of growth for a company, I think is huge.
Yeah. And then I think what you said about like, where are the pockets of opportunity, right? So if you're thinking about, okay, I am 30, in my 30s, I'm looking at making a really big career move. Okay, I have transferable skills, but like, where are the pockets of opportunity? I think you hit the nail on the head that startups are consumers of people who can just get shit done and don't care necessarily about the resume, but it's a certain class. It tends to be the earlier stage. When you get to the scale team stage, and it's well funded, then it's give me the best person at hitting this nail. It becomes very much focused on the skills side of things. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think by the time a startup gets to, maybe Series B, Series C, they're much more concerned with, I want to see someone who has grown, revenue for this type of company from, 10 million to 100 billion a year or whatever else. Right. But they also typically want to see that in a very specific context. Right. And so, those types of companies may be substantially choosier, and care a little bit more about pedigree, but it tends to be much more, recent, right? It's more the stuff that's happened in the past couple of years than anything else. Because the game has changed so much, right? Like an e-commerce company from 20 years ago looks next to nothing like an e-commerce company, that was started in the last 5 years.
Right. I want to ask about pockets of opportunity that you see sort of, for freelancers and growth there, but I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to get through. So you do this exercise, right? Experiences I love, experiences I hated, right? At this point in time where you're exiting your business or you just exited your business. What was your realization there? Like, what did you learn from doing that, and how did that guide the next phase of your career?
Yeah. So I think it really was like, that was the point at which I learned that I love to create things.
Right.
And really creating things by sort of assembling, different pieces, in my own way. And so I think at the time I was considering sort of 3 paths that were all at least somewhat related. Either I was going to go do user experience design, or I was going to go do product management, or I was going to go, be a dev. And I think, interestingly enough, I ultimately went on to do all 3 of those things, at different startups. And, but I started with the user experience design because I think that was the thing that I was most fascinated with at the time, right? How do you create a good experience for users of a website or an application, right? How do you persuade them? How do you keep them coming back? And I think that was a great choice because it really let me get into sort of user psychology, and motivation and those kinds of things, which also I think has served me super well later in my career.
Right.
But that's kind of where I started.
It's so interesting that you said you were considering 3 options. So I'm just going to relate this to like the coaching that I do now. I talk all the time about building an options portfolio. And the idea is it's really, really hard to just sit in a box and think your way to the right solution. And so you need to come up with a portfolio of possible paths you could take. And then you have to figure out how to get signal on those. Can you test and use some, of the test and learn mentality of kind of the startup psychology, and to experience things along those paths and then make a decision. Do I want to continue to commit resources to this path, or do I want to shut this off? And am I seeing growth or opportunity in another area? It sounds like you maybe did 3, not simultaneously maybe, but you ended up working in all 3. And I'm curious as to how your brain was processing how to go about giving all 3 of these a look.
Yeah. So I think, even at the time, right, I made sure to do kind of some informational interviews with people who were in each of those seats. And I think one of the things I really focused on was like, what's your day-to-day like? Mm-hmm. Right. Because I understand how people are writing about these things in terms of like learning your craft and all of that kind of stuff. But I think one of the things that really influences how happy you are in your career is whether your day-to-day is aligned with the things that you really enjoy.
Right.
And so, I wanted to get a sense from people like, okay, like you show up at work at 9 a.m. or whenever you show up, like, what are you doing? Right. How much time is in meetings? How much time is like creating? Because that was a huge driver for me. What's the nature in which you're creating? Like, what are the challenges, that kind of stuff. And I think it became really obvious to me, that like UX was like the quickest way to creation of those three options, particularly for me, because I hadn't been doing nearly as much on the dev side for a while. And I was like, okay, I'm going to have to like really spend a lot of time kind of polishing, that skill set. And so that's where I started. And I think ultimately, I ended up, leading product a few years later at the startup I started, as a UX designer at. And that really was just kind of, I sort of got pulled into it by the fact that it needed to happen. And I was interested, becoming more and more interested in it. Like there was no one leading product at the time. The company had just raised a Series A, and typically prior to raising a Series A, the CEO is the one leading product.
Yeah.
And so, I ended up filling that gap because I wanted to have a say in the strategy and the direction. And so I think that's another thing, that I really took away from this. It's like, it's okay to change direction. Not only that, like it I think it's really common. And, oftentimes as you start to feel like you've sort of mastered, or at least, got started to get good at one set of skills, like we're naturally going to be pulled into doing something different and trying new things.
Yeah, we want to be able to take on new challenges and grow our circle of competence and the way that we can exert influence and grow as people. So I can imagine you in these informational interviews, like with your sheet of paper and, like sort of tallying off, were the experiences that were being described to you, did they match? Which side of the ledger did they match for you? And ultimately it came out, there was more things aligned probably with your design in following the UX path than anything else. But of course, growth is spontaneous. Opportunities are spontaneous within the right startup. And so you got to grow your career through that lens as well. What was the next like big shift or big break for you? You are obviously working for a few different companies. What was your next sort of like real big break moment or epiphany around change?
Yeah. So I think honestly, like the next really big moment, as you mentioned, like I worked at a number of startups after that and in those types of roles. But I think, those were much more kind of natural career transitions. Like,
right.
A startup would close or somebody would recruit me or whatever else. And so, I changed, but I was kind of on this like fairly clear path. But in 2019, I found myself in, a little bit of an unenviable position. I had been working, on a new product, at a tech startup, and, I was psyched about it. We were just starting to see traction, with the product. It was like a brand new product because the company's, historical product was kind of struggling. And, basically walked into a meeting with my CEO. This was the Monday after my bachelor party. So I was, exhausted and not really expecting anything. Basically, the CEO was like, I decided I want to change direction back to what we were originally doing, because that's what I care about more. And so I was out. And I was, unhappy about it. To say the least. And, so I started a job search and I just kept not being excited by anything I was finding. It was either, I wasn't interested in the product, or, I wasn't super excited about the CEO or the rest of the leadership team. I mean, that kind of thing. And it was scary and challenging, because at the time I was saving for a wedding, I was saving to buy a house. And I was like, all right, like, I don't want to tap into the money I'm saving for these things or for retirement. I have to figure something out. And I had done a little bit of consulting on the side up to that point, but it was never something I had considered as a viable, like, real career option. But ultimately, I kind of started to feel like excited about it. And I think that was the really big pivot moment when I decided to do it. But sort of with my back against the wall a little bit, knowing that, like, I had to figure something out in a couple of months. Otherwise, I was, maybe going to have to go take one of these jobs I wasn't super excited about.
It's a natural story. I mean, it's not uncommon whatsoever. The idea that, you're safe until you're not in a company, and a lot that blind people are okay with that or understand it at some level. But then when it happens to you, it's a different feeling, and it's a blessing and a curse, because it creates a lot of anxiety to begin with. But for people who have transferable skills and have the ability and have cultivated and grown their abilities, consulting or freelance or whatever you want to call it, can be such a pathway to growth, to personal growth. And sometimes it takes that force function too. I know in my life, when I feel like I need to do something else, I procrastinate on it a lot of times, because it's uncomfortable and I don't have to do it. Right. But I have this feeling I'm being pulled that way, but I'm sort of blocking it out because it's nice and comfortable and everything is good over here. And so it's this idea that, like, how do we create these catalysts for change, at these inflection points? Like, how can we control these things a little bit more and not have to be in burn the boat situation, back against the wall? Because that is it's definitely a hard feeling to deal with. And I don't claim to have the answer, and I'm sure you don't either, but I'm throwing it out there as, like, it's a really interesting spot. It's something that I think about a lot. How do we exert more control over those inflection points? So, you came to grips with it, obviously, but what were you grappling with? There was the money thing, but I assume that it really came out of left field for you, right? The decision.
Yeah. I was surprised, because, the company had allocated a significant amount of resources towards this new project. It was going well. We were starting to get traction. So it really was like, I was shocked at the time. And it was hard because, that product was my baby, right? It was my idea. Right. I was effectively like the CEO of that product, in addition to doing design and dev work on it. And so yeah, I think that part was really hard. And I think the idea of trying to pour myself into somebody else's product that I wasn't excited about, it just felt like a deal breaker for me. And so as I kind of was looking at other companies, it was just like, none of these are going to scratch that edge.
Yeah, I think that's a really common feeling as well, for people that end up getting blindsided in a corporate setting. There's a lot of really hardworking team players out there that are committed, and they think that they are sacrificing for a team and a cause, and they're not being selfish and all this kind of stuff. And then something comes out of left field like this that really shows them eyes wide open. It's not that not that the company doesn't care about you, but everyone is expendable, and sometimes on a whim, like you experienced, right? And I think when that happens to somebody, they're like, wow, it's going to be really tough for me to be beholden to someone else in any type of situation. I'm sure you hear the same thing from your people that you work with for freelance. So you had your back against the wall and it was sort of forced here, but you fed into this. You went with it. You went with the unknown and you stepped forward into it. And it seems like from the outside, at least, that because you stepped into that uncertainty, you've come out the other side creatively more fulfilled and more in control of your situation, than you had been. So talk to us about that evolution and where you're at now.
Yeah. So, I mean, in 2019, I started that business with $0 in revenue. It's 2023 now, and I'm on track to do above 480K this year. So, I mean, from a financial perspective, it's far more than I've ever earned. So that part is great. But I think more importantly, I have substantially more autonomy and creative freedom than I had previously. I think from a flexibility standpoint, my wife and I spent a year doing the digital nomad thing, traveling all around the country and a little bit in Mexico and Canada. So that was fantastic. I work on, 5 or 6 clients at a time typically. And so I'm doing a bunch of different things, which I think ultimately, I found more fulfilling and also I think makes me a better, dev and designer and, marketer than I otherwise would be, because I get to see so many different things. But I also, I get to make my own schedule, right? Like I, typically don't do meetings on Fridays, because I don't feel like it. And it's just kind of the way I want to structure my life right now. And, that's kind of fantastic because it means I have room to work on side projects. Right. I started coaching, devs and designers and other tech folks on how to go freelance, and build successful freelance businesses at freelancegps.com. I've been doing that for, 2.5, 3 years now. It's been a ton of fun. It started as a way to kind of give back, but has grown into kind of its own little mini business as well, which is, really enjoyable. So I think it's, honestly, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, it's one of the best and frankly easiest paths to entrepreneurship because, you take away a lot of the sort of business model risk. And ultimately it's about, can you build strong relationships with good clients?
Yeah. I agree. I obviously I said it's, kind of the easiest path to step your toe in. It comes with its own challenges. Obviously, you are still selling your time for money in a lot of respects, and you have to deal with other things like, figuring out your taxes and all that kind of stuff, which we can save for a different show on all the, ins and outs of that. But you seem to have figured out some way of scaling, at least, or putting some type of structure underneath you that allows you to lever up more than maybe others would. Do you agree with that? And what's the secret sauce there? Because that is a huge hurdle from someone going, stepping out year one freelance to really gaining back some of their, their time and sanity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. And I think like ultimately for the folks who are kind of thinking about this, right. Or really any kind of entrepreneurial career transition, right? I think the reality is that everything occurs on a spectrum, right? Like ultimately, the only like fully passive income out there is investing, right? Everything else requires, and even investing oftentimes requires a substantial amount of time, one way or another, right? So the question isn't like, is it active or passive, right? It's how leveraged is it?
Right.
And I think, what I figured out, pretty quickly, was that what successful freelancers do that the rest don't is work with the best clients. And I think ultimately good clients are the ones who value and understand what you do, who are easy to sell into, who treat you like a partner, and are easy to work with on an ongoing basis. Right. And when you've got clients like that, they tend to pay substantially better. They tend to be much easier to work with. And you start to get that flexibility and autonomy and creative freedom, that I think a lot of freelancers want when they're starting out. But if you're working with clients who are constantly pinching pennies or who require tons of hand-holding, freelancing becomes the same kind of grind that any other job can be. And so, I think ultimately the game is how do you identify who the best types of clients are and how do you align your business so that you attract more of them and kind of repel everybody else?
So to be clear, you have a freelancing business. The name of it is it Allegra or something?
It's Alora.
Alora. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't find it in my notes. Alora. And is that primarily you freelancing your time in design and expertise and consulting or whatever for specific clients? Do you have do you subcontract some of that out? How does that piece of it work? And obviously we have the coaching, which I want to talk about as well.
Totally. Yeah. So it is for the most part me. I have one client that I do a little bit of subcontracting on. But it's almost exclusively me. Okay. And so I offer a combination of, web development, design, and conversion rate optimization.
Okay.
I'd say for every single client, most of my clients are either e-commerce companies or tech startups. For every single one of them, the goal in one way, shape, or form is, to increase, one of the kind of big three metrics, right? Like either increase revenue, decrease costs, or, work on retention or some other form of traction that's valuable to a startup, in terms of either making more money or raising the next round of funding. And, I take a pretty cross-functional approach. And I think is one of the other reasons, that I can charge more. Because, I'm not just charging for my time. I'm also charging for my expertise. Right. And so, I think right now, 6 clients on retainer. And, ultimately, they're paying for my time, but they're also paying, for someone who knows, these are the types of A/B tests we should run. Or, these are the types of changes we should consider making because, that's going to lead to more revenue or more sales or whatever. And so I think that is what you'll want to be thinking about if you're a freelancer is how do I get closer to the revenue or the cost savings or one of the other kind of big levers that really matters to a business? The closer you can get to that, the more of an impact you can have on that, the more you can charge. Right. And that I think is really where the secret sauce is number one, know which types of companies tend to care about those things and value the type of work you do. Can afford to pay premium rates, will ask smart questions, give good feedback. And then number two, take that and build your service offerings around those levers that they really care about. So that you're impacting them as much as possible. You're not just kind of a butt in the seat like you might be in a typical job, right? Like you are very much aligning yourself with those results.
You're listening to the Break Podcast powered by Career Cloud.
This episode is sponsored by ZipRecruiter. If you need a change and are looking for a new job, or if you're looking to hire for your small business, please check out ZipRecruiter today. Their smart technology matches the right candidates to the right jobs and sends new opportunities right to your inbox. They make finding a job or hiring the right person easier than ever. ZipRecruiter, the smarter way to hire. Try ZipRecruiter for free today by going to ZipRecruiter.com and tell them I sent you.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Because there's a very easily trackable value component, as opposed to a commoditized service or something that is essentially a cost and harder to justify. So we're kind of getting into like a lot of advice stuff around freelancing, which I'm very curious about. And obviously I have used freelance businesses to navigate career changes myself. So I have thoughts on this, but you mentioned your coaching, how to coach, or that you're coaching other freelancers. So I want to make sure you say what is the name of that coaching service again?
Yeah, so it's freelancegps.com. I've got a free course and a bunch of resources for both folks who are just starting out and also, more seasoned freelancers who kind of want to take it to the next level as well.
And so do you do like one-on-one type coaching with people, or how does that work? Okay.
So I do one-on-one coaching. I've also got, some paid courses in addition to the free resources. So it really kind of depends on what you're sort of trying to do.
Right.
But my goal for that business is to help people sort of experience the same, freedom and flexibility and increased income that I've found through freelancing. I just think it's such a fantastic life shift for a lot of people. So I kind of want to be out there helping people make it happen.
So the biggest issues I see with people coming to me talking about freelancing is, one, sort of how to start, and people overthink like, the actual nuts and bolts of putting something together. Two, how to actually get clients. You kind of walk through how to discern clients, but the idea of getting clients, and then the one I alluded to before, which is like kind of this time money trap, how to scale type situation. But I'm curious, like, because you've done more coaching than I have in the freelance world, what's the top concern that you see people struggling with when they kind of come to you?
Yeah, I think you definitely hit on some of the big ones. I'd say how to find clients is by far the number one concern, both for people who are just getting started and for freelancers who've been doing it for a while. That tends to be one of the biggest factors that sort of limits growth. And, I think a lot of times freelancers have sort of learned to do it in ways that are not all that efficient. There's a lot of ways you can find clients, right? There's freelancing sites like Upwork, there's social media, there's blogging, there's all those kinds of things. But they tend to be pretty time inefficient and highly competitive. And so what I focus on is how to do it with one-on-one conversations and taking kind of a methodical approach to building relationships. Because I found that is substantially more efficient and tends to yield much better clients than you get with the other methods. Like something like Upwork, like the so-called expert advice, if you're, trying to land a client on Upwork, is that you need to be submitting 25 to 50 proposals a week. I don't know anybody who thinks that's like their idea of fun or who could do it in less than like 20 hours and have those proposals be any kind of quality. So it's super inefficient. And I think freelancers oftentimes kind of get caught up in that because they're outsourcing their sales and marketing to, somebody else rather than owning it themselves.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I see huge overlap between what works and what stands out with job seekers, and it's the same function and getting clients. It's networking is business development. Like that's it, period.
Right.
So the people that go and try to submit 10,000 resumes a day to find a job lose. And the people who figure out the game of making actual connection and having conversation and providing value up front win. Like hands down, like that. They are the exact same thing. So people can learn a ton from Tim here, and his approach to getting clients, and just turn around and apply that to what I need to do, from a job standpoint. So give us a couple like little teaser tips that you talk to people about in terms of this biz dev, human contact secret sauce that you have.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I always have the folks I'm coaching kind of work through is, once they know who their ideal clients are, right? Number one, where are my ideal clients hanging out, both online and in the real world, right? And that could be, industry groups, meetup, Slack groups, startup accelerators, co-working spaces, like any of that kind of stuff, right? And so starting to like identify where those locations are, particularly the ones that are local to you, so that you can go and out and participate in the community, is a huge, huge help. And the second one is who already knows my ideal clients who could potentially introduce me. And not just in your own network, but people who are going to tend to know your ideal clients. Oftentimes, one of the best sources is other freelancers, particularly those in complementary industries, right? So if you're a developer, right, your best friends should be design freelancers and marketing freelancers, because they're already working with your ideal clients and they don't compete with you, right? And so they're going to be willing to introduce you. They're also tend to be the first people your clients ask when they're looking for someone who does what you do, right? And so those are kind of two of the places I recommend starting. And then I think the other thing I tend to focus on with people is effectively like getting your reps in, right? Because I think that there is there's a balance, right, between the people who go way too far in the direction of like, I'm going to, submit the 10,000 resumes, right? Like the freelancing equivalent of that is I'm going to send, 10,000 spam emails to people.
Right.
Right. So like that's one end of the spectrum, but the other end of the spectrum is doing nothing, right? And waiting for people to come to you. Right. And so I think that the other piece of it, how do you approach this in a way that's methodical? And you're putting in enough effort that you're going to get out of it what you need to, and hit your goals as far as, how many clients you get and how much revenue you want to make.
What, do you have like off the cuff numbers, to set people's expectations here? Like, that you've seen or heard, and obviously it varies by industry, but how many, either outreach or touch points per, client landed kind of a thing, just to give people a sort of an idea of the output that actually is required.
Yeah. So I think if you were talking, to people in a really like natural way, right? Like it's high quality, it's personable, it's warm, right? I have found, if you're having 3 to 5 conversations a week, you can land a new client somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. When you're first starting out, it's going to take longer and you're going to need to have more conversations than that, because there's, a lot of stuff you need to learn, and you need to kind of get your positioning and your approach to these things right. But that's typically what I've seen, once people kind of get going. But the more you move kind of down that spectrum, towards something being, sort of cold, or spammy or interruptive, you have to increase your numbers to make up for that. And so part of it is really thinking through, how do I do this in a way where I'm acting like a person, not like, a marketing robot, right? Because people can tell the difference, and, your results are going to show that, right? If people feel interrupted or like you're taking advantage of them, you're going to get nowhere fast, and you're going to have to do way more for the same amount of return.
And I assume the other piece of this is really understanding like who the decision makers are and how to get in front of them, especially if you're looking at larger companies. With startups, it's rather easy because there's just less people, but I assume that's a piece of this as well. where are you seeing, getting back to like the pockets of opportunity? So obviously you do a lot of dev design work. From your experience, are you seeing other like big pockets of opportunity of certain functions that are really business functions that are really leaning into freelance, utilizing freelance workers, or anything out there where people might be saying, "Oh, geez, I didn't think about that," but the freelance growth market is kind of really growing?
Yeah, I mean, beyond dev and design, I think marketing is obviously a huge one. There are just so many companies out there who have very little kind of core competence in marketing, and obviously, like every company needs it in one way, shape, or form, right? Whether it's a B2B company that needs biz dev, or a consumer company that needs someone running their Facebook ads or running their social media. Like every company needs to attract customers to grow. So that definitely is a huge one. I think anything that relates to people and staffing is another really big one, right? Like helping people or companies, find the right people, is absolutely huge. Those are some of the places that I'm seeing the most opportunity. I also coach a lot of copywriters. There's, a ton of freelance copywriting going on. And
Yep.
Honestly, the vast majority of content creation is probably happening through freelance.
Right.
So that's another place I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly if you're willing to innovate a little bit and not just kind of follow the same template that everybody else is.
Yeah, you got to be able to take a little bit of risk to stand out, type of a deal. Okay. Very cool. I want to try to land this plane here. I know we've taken a lot of your time, so I'm gonna get to some of our rapid fire questions, close this out, and make sure tie up any loose ends or anything that I missed. But let's go to some rapid fire questions. So my audience is really interested. They're always looking to follow new people. So is there a recent author, thought leader, or influencer that you've come across that's really caught your attention that you think people need to know about?
Yeah, so this guy named Jay Klaus, I think he's absolutely fantastic. He runs creative science or creator science, So if you are a content creator in any way, whether it's you're a podcaster or a blogger or you're working on a course or something like that, he's absolutely the guy for you. I also think, just generally speaking, he has a ton to teach anyone kind of serious about their career. In terms of, personal branding and how you kind of differentiate yourself. So he's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I know him and have followed his stuff. Yeah, and I second that. Very good. What about a recent book or any book that you think has had like the most impact, on your thinking, and how you've pursued your career?
Yeah. So, this is maybe a little bit less recent, but there's a great book called The First 20 Hours by Josh Kaufman. And the whole idea is almost the opposite of Malcolm Gladwell's sort of 10,000 hours theory, right? Which is about how much time it takes to become like a world-class expert at something, right? So this book is all about how to learn any new skill just enough to be competent at it in about 20 hours. And I think that is an absolutely fantastic mindset for people to take, particularly entrepreneurs and freelancers, because the reality is you don't necessarily have to be world-class at everything, right? There's a lot that you can do if you just know the basics and a little bit more than most people. And typically, if you take a pretty structured approach to learning a new skill, you can get to that level of competence in about 20 hours. And so one of the ways I see folks applying that is, a lot of the freelancers I coach, are asking me like, okay, Tim, like, how do I stop just selling my time and earn more and have more leverage? And oftentimes the answer is by combining some complementary skills. Right. And so, if you're a developer, for example, right, adding a little bit of UX design, if you're a copywriter, adding a little bit of SEO, Those types of things can strengthen your service offering substantially. Oftentimes by just learning the basics, you can earn 25-50% more than you would otherwise because your offering gets that much stronger.
What I love about this book too is it speaks to the taking the experimental mindset to skill building too, and the idea that you don't have to make a decision and then commit the rest of your life to trying to, learn software development. I go against the grain. I'm like, for the vast majority of people, they shouldn't learn it because they're never going to be as good as a developer. It makes sense to learn 20 hours of it so you can communicate properly with a developer. But you can take 20 hours, and if you go learn some skill that you never actually apply, it's not that big of a failure. You're right. It's not that big of a waste, and you can just kind of go to the next thing. But if you're taking the mindset that you got to spend 10,000 hours at every skill you build, you're not getting off the ground. So that's what I really love about that recommendation the most. All right. What about, you've had some experience in the world, you've changed jobs a bunch and reinvented your career. What's one piece of advice that you have that your number one piece of advice you would give to somebody just starting out, like in your shoes, coming out of college?
Yeah. I mean, I would say ultimately treat your career and also just everything in your career like it's an experiment. Yeah. I'm a huge fan of sort of the lean startup philosophy.
Yep.
So much so that it's really become, I think, in many ways like a lifestyle for me. So the question is ultimately, how do you design experiments that are going to get you the answer as quickly as possible, right? And so, when you think about it that way, rather than spending 2 years learning a really hard lesson, if you can learn something in a few days or a week, because you figure out a way to sort of de-risk it for yourself, that's huge. And I think that mindset has really served me well, in my career, but also, as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, totally agree. I love that. And what we teach people about finding their path is the lessons come from 3 disciplines. 1 is human-centered design, 2 is investing, and 3 is entrepreneurship and lean startup. And all 3 of those disciplines have this, rapid iteration, test and learn, experimental mindset. And I think that needs to get forced in to people who force-fed to people who need to figure out their path. So I couldn't agree with you more. All right, Tim, what's got you excited about the next 12 months?
One of the things I think that the industry has seen really just since the advent of COVID, but even kind of preceding it, is like a massive growth in the number of freelancers.
Right.
So much so that I think by 2026, it's predicted that there will be more people freelancing in the US than working full time. So far, it's actually been ahead of pace, the change to that. So it's that I think is just hugely exciting for me because I think it means more people having freedom and flexibility, more people having ownership over their careers in a way that they probably otherwise wouldn't. And so just getting to be a part of that has been, amazing, and is something I'm super excited about for 2024.
I'm stoked about that as well. I think the more the merrier. People getting out, experiencing, working for themselves is just great for society. It's great for the ownership mindset and delivering on responsibilities. And I think it's going to make us a stronger and more resilient economy. So I'm really stoked about that as well. All right, Tim, I really appreciate you being here. Tell our audience where they can learn more about you, where they can follow your journey, where your courses and material are. Leave us off with that stuff.
Yeah, so you can find me at freelancegps.com. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter. Happy to chat with folks. I do 3 hour-long strategy sessions for anyone who's either thinking about starting freelancing or is already freelancing and feels stuck and wants to get unstuck. So check out the free course. Feel free to reach out. Love to chat and would love to help.
Excellent. Yep. That's freelancegps.com in case you didn't hear it. And it's Tim Noetzel. It's spelled Noetzl. We will have all the links that we talked about in our show notes page when this goes live, but let's use Tim as a resource. I want my break community to use Tim as a resource. He's been super helpful with his time here. He's got a lot of knowledge and clearly he's killing it in the freelance space. So let's use him, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. Tim, thank you for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, buddy.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Mike.